This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. James Barker. Dr. Barker is Associate Professor of New Testament at Western Kentucky University and the author of the brand new book, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics, out now on Eerdmans. In this book, Dr. Barker argues that Mark was the first gospel to be written, that Matthew used Mark, that Luke used both, and that John knew all three. He talks about ancient compositional and writing practices to demonstrate his theory. We'll be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Barker, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
I'm really excited to talk to you. As we were discussing during the show, I've done a lot of episodes on the Next Quest for the Historical Jesus book recently, and I've been talking to a lot of scholars just about the methods that we use to analyze the Synoptic Gospels and the information that they can give us about Jesus. And I've really been fascinated with the Synoptic problem for a long time. And as I was telling you, I think that the approach that you outline in this book is essentially correct. Like this is what I believe. So I'm really excited for you to talk about it. But before we do, just tell my audience a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I grew up in Johnson City, Tennessee, very northeast Tennessee, close to the Bristol racetrack. If you're a NASCAR fan, went to University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and studied with Dave Dungan there. And the Synoptic problem was his lifelong obsession, and became mine by studying with him. And then I actually did a year of campus ministry overseas after I graduated college. And then I wanted to pay off the student loans that I had taken out to go to college. So I got a job and I was working at Dell selling computers in Nashville. And I kept in touch with Dave Dungan in Knoxville. And I said, hey, is there anybody in Nashville that I should meet, especially somebody at Vanderbilt? And he just pointed right at me and said, yes, you need to introduce yourself to Amy Jo Levine. You need to tell her that you were my student. And if you're thinking about pursuing graduate studies, that's who you should study with. And so I did my master's at the Divinity School and was fortunate enough to stay there, do my doctorate. And AJ was my advisor, and wrote my dissertation on John's use of Matthew, which is kind of what got all of this rolling. Very few people at the time would have said that John had any relationship whatsoever to Matthew's gospel, which made it a good dissertation topic, right? Because it's not been tilled over so much that it's just sand. And in the course of that, AJ has her own book on the Gospel of John. She has this nice little paragraph about me saying her dissertation advisor at Duke, Moody Smith, was famous for saying, John didn't know the Synoptic Gospels. Too different. Stop chasing your tail looking for this stuff. And she said, my student, James Barker, has convinced me otherwise. So that's sort of the educational lineage, and then had 3 visiting professorships before I did end up with a tenure track job and before I got tenure. So now I've been in Kentucky for over a decade, and it's as long as I've been anywhere other than growing up in East Tennessee.
So what motivated you to write this book? There are a lot of books about the synoptic problem out there, and they all have kind of different angles to them. What made you want to contribute to this conversation in a full-length book form?
A lot of it had to do with what I did in the dissertation, because and we'll talk plenty about synoptic problem, I'm sure, but that had been the original motivation, and never thought I would get into John, and just sort of bought into what everybody was saying at the time, that, or the majority of folks were saying at the time, that John's not related to the synoptics. And I just sort of stumbled into it and realized, the synoptic problem is complicated, but John's relationship to the synoptics is even more complicated. And the more I started to work with that idea, the more I realized you can't really do one without the other. I mean, obviously you can, and plenty of people had. I don't think you can do it as well if you don't first say, this is how I think the synoptics were written, and this is how I think John relates to them. So, initially I had written John's use of Matthew, and I was approached by an editor at Eerdmans, Alan Myers, may he rest in peace. And he just said, hey, I see what else you're working on. Could this lead to a book? And I said, yeah, I laid out a basic structure and thought I would just sort of methodically say John's use of Matthew, John's use of Mark, John's use of Luke. And it took me 10 years to write the book, but it completely changed because I went down the rabbit hole of, well, how did you write a book in the first place? And how do we answer the synoptic problem? And once you put those two pieces in place, that John knew all three synoptics. And it really was the kind of thing like, why a book, right? Why not 5 different articles? Well, because it hangs together. And I think you could read any one of my chapters in isolation, and students could do that and benefit from it. And I have no problem with excerpting. I talk about excerpting as an ancient compositional practice. That's fine, right? Pull it out and just read chapter 3. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you do read the book from start to finish, I do think there's a cumulative case to be made to say, okay, the more we hammer away at this, the more this clarity we actually get from this.
Yeah, and that actually makes a lot of sense. And that's been one of my frustrations with people like you that hold to the FAR theory. And I guess I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but it's just that it seems to be like that people will present that, but there's never been like an attempt to try to bring all of these different strands together and lay them out in one long argument. I suppose before we get into those specifics, maybe I'll have you explain to my audience what the synoptic problem is. I know I've done some episodes on the Gospels before where I've talked about it a little bit, and then obviously in some of my conversations with the contributors to the Next Quest book, that came up from time to time, but I don't think I've ever had anyone like you just lay it out before. So explain the synoptic audience to my or explain the synoptic problem to my audience.
Sure. It is the question you kind of come to when you read the Gospels and when lay people read the Gospels for themselves. Because if you just read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call those the synoptic Gospels, which literally just means you can see them side by side by side. Roughly 90% is our typical figure of the Gospel of Mark is repeated somewhere in Matthew and or Luke. And so you say, why are these 3 Gospels so similar and yet so different? So that question has been around since the beginning. And it was new to me when I got to college and started studying with a professional biblical scholar, but it really kind of started to irk me that I'd spent my whole life reading the Gospels and nobody had ever talked to me about this, say, in a congregational setting. So I think it matters, and it mattered to folks like St. Augustine. It mattered to folks like Justin Martyr, to Tatian, who made a harmony of the 4 Gospels that I've written a book about. Origen, when he wrote his commentaries, when he gets to a story, he writes a commentary on John, and he'll say, okay, well, now we read this story in all the Gospels, so, and they'll lay out all the similarities and all the differences. Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they're so tight, because there's so much overlap, they have to be related in some way. And they are so related because of so many verbatim agreements that it is not just that they've all heard a story that Jesus fed the 5,000, or they've heard a story of the crucifixion and resurrection. It is that somebody is reading somebody else, sometimes copying them verbatim, and then other times tweaking what their source said. And we get into some chicken and egg situations where the reason we have multiple rival hypotheses for solving the synoptic problem is because no one is perfect, because there's always an exception, but you sort of weigh the evidence and say, okay, what makes the most sense to say, if we go from here to there, we can see the types of changes that are characteristic of one of the gospel writers. And then we try to say, okay, I think they were written in this order, and with this one using that one, perhaps this one also, or maybe not that one, perhaps some hypothetical source. But scholars have been up to this for a long time. I mentioned some of the ancients who knew the problem, and they're still important to read, vital reading, in my opinion. But when we get to the critical age and the last 200 years of critical scholarship, it's also especially important to say, okay, when we didn't just assume all these ancient testimonies that all 4 Gospels are apostolic in their origin in some way, there was an apologetic agenda there, and for good reason, when Christians were a persecuted minority, right? But when we get to the modern age, it's quite all right to take a bigger step back and say, okay, we don't have to hold to some of these traditions as dogma. We can actually just look at how people wrote books and answer some of these questions much more simply if we just look at book writing and ancient rhetoric.
Yeah. Now, I can imagine that an informed and educated layperson might pick up a book with a title like yours, and they'll see the Gospels on the cover of it. And so they'll go to that book thinking that it's going to be a book about Jesus, and it's not. So explain to my audience real quick how the synoptic problem and your analysis of the synoptic problem is different from historical Jesus research.
Great question. Yeah. And this is one where I think you can do one without the other. My book, I have done so. And I say at the beginning, this is not a book about the historical Jesus. To be clear, it is not that I doubt the existence of the historical Jesus. I am not a mythicist, and I will footnote to that effect and say that's not an argument that I'm going to entertain. Yes, there was a Jesus, but part of this for me has to do with having written a book on Tatian's Diatessaron. He took all four Gospels and he reworked them to write one harmonious gospel, much like you might make a contemporary Jesus film. And when I was working on that, I started saying, well, why does he move this over there? Why does he cluster? Well, all these are rich guys or people who have questions about money. And so he gathers things thematically and puts them together. He takes one thing that happens in one place, puts it in a completely different place. And I started seeing, well, that's what the canonical Gospels do too. And every time I would start to talk historical Jesus with folks, they would be limited to the canon, and they would want to say things like, well, go back to an ancient apologetic argument like Augustine. Well, Jesus must have ransacked the temple or the commerce, disrupted the commerce in the temple on two occasions, because John said it happened at the first of three Passovers in his gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke only have one Passover during Jesus' ministry, and that's when you get the disruption of the commerce temple, which gets Jesus killed a week later, right? So for a long time, the question was, well, they must both be true, or which one of them is true? You know what Tatian did with the Diatessaron? He had three Passovers like John and said it was at the second of three that Jesus disrupted. And I'm like, great. Your answer was none of the above to when did Jesus disrupt the commerce in the temple. And so every time I would throw that back at a historical Jesus scholar, I could start to sense, at least for some scholars, a little bit of this canonical privilege, canonical prejudice even, where Tatian didn't matter. And I thought he absolutely matters because he's much more skilled rhetorically than anybody, a little bit better than Luke being the best of our four of the canonical Gospels. But Tatian's an even better educated rhetorician. And so he knows what he's doing, but he's not trying to tell you what really happened, right? What did Jesus really say? And when and where precisely did he do it? The Gospels exercise liberties. Again, like modern Jesus films, I teach Jesus in film. I think in these terms. You can reorder things like beads on a string. Probably want the birth of Jesus near the beginning of your gospel. Probably need death, resurrection, if you're going to include the ascension too from Luke. Put that at the end. Other than the passion narrative, everything else, does it matter when he tells what parable, when he does what healing? So this idea of, did he really do this? Did he really say this? And how can we know? I don't want to dismiss folks who are obsessed with that question, because they could be equally dismissed with my research questions. It's just, they're not my questions, because ultimately I don't think that we can give solid answers to them. What did he really say and do, when and where? I'll say, I don't know. I'm agnostic, not in a faith sense, but in the historical sense. I don't think we can actually know exactly when and where any of this stuff happened. I think gospel writers took great liberties with their source material, and Origen said the same thing around the year 250 and said, I don't begrudge the gospel writers for relocating one story, telling it in different words, placing a whole thing at a different time and place. And I've adopted Origen's approach to say, yeah, let's listen to the gospel writers. Because a funny thing about a historical Jesus reconstruction in the modern era or an ancient gospel harmony, What happens is now you're not listening to the four canonical evangelists.
Right.
You've come up with the one thing none of them say. And so that takes a great deal of prerogative too, right? So to me, better to say the ancient authors could exercise their own literary prerogative and say, yeah, I think I like this better here. Luke does that a whole lot, for example.
Yeah, and I really do think that once you understand the synoptic problem, I know for me too, this was a big turning point in my conceptualization of the kind of information that the Gospels was supposed to give us. Once you understand the synoptic problem, you realize that a lot of those historical questions are kind of irrelevant. Like they cease to matter in the way that they might in some quarters of Christianity. Now, of course, like the method that you use, and this is kind of the technical term for this process, is called redaction criticism, where you look at the way that the Gospel writers have utilized their sources. And there have been a lot of different camps within New Testament scholarship that have dealt with redaction criticism and the synoptic problem in different ways. So as we start to get into some of the more technical aspects of your book, maybe talk about the different solutions to the synoptic problem that have been on offer throughout history, because there are, like, I think in your book, you have the diagram in the opening chapter. I think you present like 6 or 8 different ways that people have tried to reconcile. And I know there are only a handful of them that are like really mainstream and popular, but what are some of the ways that people have tried to deal with the synoptic problem?
Sure. Yeah. And I actually, if folks are interested, on my academia.edu page, I have a handout that I use in my classes, and I say anybody can use this. It's a synoptic problem handout. And so I have the diagrams. The arrows from one gospel to another are an arrow showing the exertion of influence. So if there is a St. Augustine, for example, to start with the earliest solution, he's reading his New Testament with the Gospels ordered as we know them in English: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he just says, sort of off the cuff, well, they must have been written in that order. So for the longest time, when people looked at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which have so many similarities compared to John, which we'll get to, they just thought, okay, they were written in that order. That became known as the Augustinian hypothesis, and it sort of got ossified in a way Augustine never really intended. In the late 18th century, Johann Jacob Griesbach said, you know what I think actually happened is Matthew wrote first, because we have all this patristic testimony that Matthew wrote the first gospel. But I think then Luke used Matthew, and Mark just sort of made an abridgment of the two. Now, today, it's easy for us to look at that and say, well, then why write a gospel at all, right? Why leave it? And so that's why a whole century of scholarship then kicked off. Griesbach is a very serious placeholder for saying we have to reopen this question in the modern era, in the critical era. And so fast forward 100 years, and we end up with what we now know as Markan priority, that Mark wrote the first gospel. It's the shortest gospel. It starts with the baptism. It ends with some guy who says that Jesus had been resurrected. The end, right? And it leaves. Jesus was such a great teacher. Well, what was his teachings? Okay, well, one chapter, I'll tell you some parables that nobody understood. And then he'll tell you the end of the world is coming and you're done. And so, but it makes sense to look at Mark on that level as this highly condensed thing, not saying that he took Matthew and Luke and left out the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, the Lord's Prayer, all of this great material that you know so well in church. It makes more sense to say later gospel writers expanded on Mark's beginning narrative. So that's what happened, though, was that Matthew and Luke have all of this stuff like the Lord's Prayer, a whole lot of sayings, few narratives involving John the Baptist that aren't in Mark. And in the 19th century, by the early 20th century, we had turned that into this long lost document Q. The Q is just shorthand for Quelle, which just means source. That is the other source that Matthew and Luke independently used in addition to Mark. So the idea was now there was no arrow from Matthew to Luke or from Luke to Matthew, that they were just independent gospels. They just had the same source material. Why do they have so much stuff from Mark? Because they were both reading Mark. How do they have all this other teaching of Jesus? Well, because they had this document Q. And it's also important to say, really, it's only the last 50 to 60 years that Q became ossified as a document, because even in the 50s and 60s, you would find Q scholars. We call this the two source hypothesis. Mark and Q were the two sources used independently by Matthew and Luke. Sometimes people were still saying, even in the 60s, well, Q could have just been oral and maybe it was never written down. It's like the British Constitution or whatever. But it really did turn into this thing of, no, it was a document. So it's not just the two source hypothesis, it's the two document hypothesis. And you can get this huge 1,000-page reconstruction of what Q said line by line, even though it was this tiny document, right? And so that held sway for most of the 20th century. Little bit of a revival of the Griesbach hypothesis from folks like my mentor, Dave Dungan, who said, yeah, but there are all these connections from Luke to Matthew, even in stories told by Mark. And those details aren't in Mark. How do y'all explain those? Well, they're minor agreements becomes the catch-all term for. But you count them up, and when there gets to be dozens, maybe 100 or more, how minor are they really, right? So two-source hypothesis really held the day, to a point that Bill Farmer, when he wrote the synoptic problem, sort of became a mentor to my mentor. He was at Southern Methodist University. He was laughed out of the room, ridiculed, treated horribly by scholars of the synoptic problem, because the working assumption was it wasn't a problem, it's been solved, and Q is the solution. Now, today, synoptic problem scholarship is much more congenial. The few of us who are left who study it,
right.
we know each other, we get along, even if we have different solutions, and we can have really nice conversations. A shame that it wasn't the case 60 years ago. But the Farrer hypothesis comes along. Austin Farrer writes a short essay called On Dispensing with Q. Well, the Augustinian hypothesis didn't have a Q, and the Griesbach hypothesis didn't have a Q, but they both assumed that Matthew was written first. And Farrer says, rightly, the priority of the Gospel of Mark, that it's the first one written, that is a triumph of 19th century scholarship. And we should not jettison that. We should keep that in place. But we don't need a Q to explain the stuff that Matthew and Luke have in common. Matthew just used Mark, and then Luke used Matthew and Luke. So I just said that wrong. Mark wrote first, Matthew used Mark, Luke used both Matthew and Mark. And so if you take Q out of the equation, well, now the minor agreements aren't so minor, and they're easily explained as details that Luke picked up from Matthew by comparing Matthew and Mark in the same story and picking and choosing which details he wanted to include or exclude. And that, thanks mostly to Mark Goodacre, but also Michael Goulder's commentary on Luke said, it gave a great defense of, I'm working from this hypothesis, the Farrer hypothesis. And in Mark Goodacre's work, The Case Against Q, says similarly, we have to start with the beginning and say yes to Mark and priority. So no to the Augustinian hypothesis, no to the Griesbach hypothesis, but no to the two-source hypothesis when it comes to Q. And so that there has been a growing number of New Testament scholars who are convinced by that. And it is really, to me and to my fellow Farrer adherents, the Occam's razor argument. It just solves the most problems the easiest. The last one I'd mentioned briefly is there's been a recent resurgence of a really old idea of, well, what if it's Mark, Luke, and then Matthew? Well, in my book, I try to show a lot of places where I think, like others have, that Luke knows Matthew and Mark, and it doesn't work when you flip it. Places where it just doesn't make as much sense the other way. But it's important that folks have done good work on this. Robert McEwen did a dissertation on it to say, hey, if you invert this, what happens when we look at it this way? We need to have that scholarship out there so that you don't just shrug it off or dismiss it. We have an open forum and we can talk about it. But the Farrer has really gained momentum, and I'm grateful for that and hopeful to be a part of its growing number of adherents.
Yes. And I really do think that it makes a lot of sense. And I felt that way ever since coming in contact with Mark Goodacre's work a really long time ago. And you bring some new methodological tools and insights to the table in this book that I was unfamiliar with. And I want to go through some of these. And I think that once you look at the cumulative argument for the far hypothesis, it just makes sense that that seems to be the most sensible way of understanding the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels and, as you're going to go on to argue later on, John's Gospel too. One of the ancient techniques that you talk about in your book is, and I'm going to butcher the Latin here, but it's oppositio and imitando. Was I close with that?
That's great. That's as well as I could say it.
Beautiful. Well, tell me and my audience what that is and how that works in respect to our understanding of the composition of the Gospels.
I owe that term. I had a classicist on my dissertation committee, and I was talking about how John used Matthew. And I came to one point and I said, now this is going to sound counterintuitive, but I'm going to say that John is so different from Matthew that John has to know what Matthew did, and he just inverted it. And so when I was actually during the defense, because I hadn't even shared that portion of the dissertation with this particular committee member, and he said, well, in classics, we call that oppositio in imitando. It's a modern term. It's a modern term like damnatio in memoriae, right? An emperor like Domitian dies, and we see this erasure of all of the things he built because people hated him so much. So in antiquity, they didn't use the term damnatio memoriae, but they did strike out all of the things that they had built. So we use a modern term to illustrate an ancient technique. Oppositio and imitando works the same way. They don't talk that way in antiquity about what they're doing, but they do it. And so he raised that, and my advisor, A.J. Levine, said, hey, when you revise this for a book, be sure to use that. That's very helpful terminology. So as I'm revising that book, right, to become a book, and I'm pitching this book that I've now written, I'm teaching at Rhodes College in Memphis for a year, and I'm teaching Homer's Odyssey, and I'm teaching Virgil's Aeneid. And when Odysseus goes to Hades, he sees his mother, and he's been shipwrecked for 6 years, living with a goddess, and he didn't know his mom had died. And so he sees her, and he tries to hug her 3 times, but he can't because she's a ghost, right? Well, early on in the Aeneid, when Aeneas is trying to escape Troy with his wife and his father, finds out his father dies because he tries to hug him 3 times, and he can't because his father has just been killed in battle. And then Virgil repeats the scene when Aeneas also visits the underworld, reconnects with his father, but not bodily because, again, his dad's a spirit. So you can say, oh, well, it's his father, not his mother, right? Well, the first one didn't happen in the underworld. It happened on Earth. You could list all the differences, and you could say the differences outweigh the similarities. But then you can say, yeah, but for Aeneas, his mother was a goddess who's immortal, so it doesn't make any sense for his mother to die. It's only his father. And you could see this and say, we know if ever there is an imitation in antiquity, it's Virgil self-consciously taking the Iliad and the Odyssey and combining the 2 Greek epics into one great Roman epic, right? There's no way he doesn't know that story. So just because he moves this one little episode to a totally different place and changes the character doesn't mean he's ignorant of his source. It means he's very creatively rewriting it, so much so that he turns it inside out. Once we start to see people doing that in antiquity, it opens up. It's like you had the curtains open this much, and you pull them all the way open, and now you have a panorama, and you can really start to explain a lot more of, okay, I've noted these differences, and I've noted that 100 years of scholarship has noted these differences, but they just sort of have question mark or just yet another difference. Some of these differences cluster together in such a way to say, I think it's different intentionally because this needed to be turned inside out. And once you start to look for it, you will start to find it. And I'm happy to leave it to others to find plenty more examples that I haven't found. But But yeah, I think we see it in the Synoptics, and we especially see it with John and the Synoptics. And again, when you know this is anybody who wrote a gospel went to school and learned how to write, and these imitation start by literally copying a text by hand. Now start by taking an episode and rewriting it, and then see how you can invert it and see what's going on. Augustine talks about this. He's a professor of rhetoric, and he's given the task of writing a speech that Dido would have given in the Aeneid, but you can't use a single word that Dido actually speaks. But this better sound like Dido, right? And so he's composing this way in imitating his source material. So I just think it makes more sense to place the gospel writers in their Greco-Roman context, look at how people learned to write, and then look at how relatively skillful they were at pulling this off. And really it does start to make sense. Things fall into place.
Yeah, another really interesting aspect of your book is that you talk about the physical writing process that ancient writers would have had to use to compose a given text, and you actually wound up like physically recreating some of those ancient styles of writing. So, talk to my audience about that. What were ancient compositional techniques like, and what was your experience literally physically reconstructing ancient writing materials?
So glad you asked about this. This is my favorite thing, and so probably cool. My greatest contribution. I think if you compare my book to others on the same topic, because God knows there's a stack of them. I had the good fortune. This summer will be actually our 10-year anniversary. The National Endowment for the Humanities had a colloquium of a bunch of medievalists that I was fortunate enough to join. There were only 2 New Testament scholars. The rest were medievalists. And we went to the University of Iowa for about a month, and we actually stretched out goat. We scraped the hair off a goat skin. We stretched it out. We put water on it. We scraped it down, stretched it some more, and then cut it up, prepped it for writing, and used quill and ink and reenacted medieval writing practices. And when you get to parchment, that's in antiquity too. And so it was really helpful to learn from medievalists. And it was also very nicely symbiotic for me to kind of talk about, well, papyrus would work this way. And so one of the leaders there said, oh, I've got some papyrus. Would you like to make a papyrus codex? So I made my first papyrus codex. And so I started to think differently about everything. And that was the goal of this seminar. It was called, manuscript materiality, but interpretation through production. If you take the time physically to, as best you can, reenact what it was actually like to write these texts and write them out by hand, you start to think about them entirely differently. So when I start that chapter, I start talking about my freshman year of high school when I took a year-long typing class, and there were at least 50 very loud typewriters pounding in my head Monday through Friday at 8 o'clock in the morning. And my students today, many of them have never used a typewriter.
Yeah.
And so, but if you'd written this book 50 years ago, it would have been with a typewriter. And you would have been so grateful that you had the typewriter, which was so much faster than writing the whole thing out longhand, that then went straight from longhand to typesetting, right? So in my lifetime, the speed with which we can write, rewrite, edit, cut, paste, all those things, that has all changed since I was in high school, right? So I think a lot of anachronisms, people say, oh, you're talking about typewriters, these modern analogies, it's anachronistic. No, what's anachronistic is the assumptions that most modern scholars make about how ancient writing materials work. So I said, well, you started with a wax tablet. So I did some research. I said, well, what did those look like? About how big were they? Okay, they were about this big. And you wrote them, with the top sheet and the bottom sheet. And together that gave you close to what one column of a papyrus scroll would have been. So then I said, okay, well, what would a papyrus scroll would have looked like? Here's one of the Gospel of John.
Oh, that's cool.
well, let's just unroll it and let's start reading the Greek text. And people say it was really, really, really hard to manipulate the scroll, to scroll it forwards and backwards. And so I made one. And I said, no, actually, with very little practice, I could go from beginning to end in 5 minutes. And I can scan as I read when I do that. And there's this great article from 100 years ago. A classicist named T.C. Skeet says, people talk about scrolls like they were cumbersome to use. My wife had some wallpaper. And so I just took that roll of wallpaper and I rolled it around, and it's actually not that hard. And so that's been lying around forever for us to use. But again, I learned a lot by reenacting it. And so making a wax tablet, I think you have to use power tools if you want to do New Testament scholarship right. So I did one of my boards for my wax tablet with a chisel to earn my stripes, but then I used a router for the others. Figured out a recipe that works for the wax, and figured out that it is more readable if you burn a little papyrus and you dip that in to give it that nice charcoal hue so that it's not as hard to read up against the light. Figured out that, yeah, I can write pretty small, pretty fast. You can put this many letters per sheet. The more pages, if you will, in your tablet, the more text you can write out. But you take a standard little story in the Gospels and it'll fit on a tablet. And you can erase with a tablet just by marking it out because it's wax. And then you rewrite. So you can get the one story pretty much the way you want. And then however much you've written in however many tablets, then you can transfer it to a scroll, which is what you would have then used for a draft. You still would have edited that draft. You might have relocated a lot of things and annotated it in what way to tell you where you want to move stuff. You might have inserted stuff, so you leave some room in the margins. But you start with the wax tablet. Quintilian tells us this. He writes this long treatise on rhetoric that's longer than the entire New Testament. And he says that's where you start. You sit and you think and you write it out. And then when you're at a good time, you transfer it to a scroll. Pliny tells us the same thing. Oh, my uncle used to do this all the time. So we know this is how ancients wrote. But until you've done it for yourself, you're prone to make a lot of assumptions about how hard it was. And so the more I worked with it, I thought, well, it wouldn't be hard to use a scroll if that's all you'd been using for 1,000 years.
Right.
It's the codex that was new and like first century, but I don't think any of the Gospels were written on a codex. I think that transfer happens probably in the 2nd century, but here's a nice codex I made of the Gospel of John.
Yeah.
So you compare the two and you can see, well, this one's more portable than that one. I can kind of see how that caught on. You're using the front and the back, which scrolls rarely do, right? You use it as a book as we know it. A codex would have been cumbersome to anyone 100 years earlier. Like if I gave, my grandparents are all deceased, but if I handed them a cell phone today, right, what would they do with that? So I think that when you get back to how things were written, one example I give, people say, well, to reposition within a codex would have been hard. Well, that is already false. I've proven that. Anybody who takes a day to practice knows that you can, to relocate within a scroll. That takes too much time. No, it takes like 1 to 2 minutes. You know what takes time is copying out by hand the one story you relocated. So I spent a lot of time copying things out by hand. And I would ask your audience or any New Testament scholar, how much time have you actually spent doing that? Copy out a page. If you know Greek, use a Greek New Testament. If you know English, just do it in English. Copy out one. Now you then have to collate and see if you made any mistakes. It's easier if there's two of us to do that. But if you're doing it by yourself, that takes longer than the actual copying. And the copying, man, does your hand get tired, right? So I think the more I did that, the more I thought, thinking about what you're going to write, getting to, I know I want to use that story from Mark, but I know I want to put it somewhere else. All of that started to become easy. Was it more time consuming? Absolutely. But no one 50 years ago could have imagined me copying and pasting and deleting an entire sentence and not having to retype the whole page, right? So the time consumption is relative. And the ancient writing materials, once you understand what they were, that they were not cumbersome if that's all you had ever used in your educated life, and you were one of the 10% who could actually write a book, or even read a book in antiquity, I just don't think it becomes hard at all.
Yeah. Well, I will say that part of your book was really interesting because I've never considered that before. And I had a Paul professor in college, and every time I took a section of his Paul class, and I probably took like 6 or 7 with him, we do Romans, the pastoral epistles, Corinthians. He always required us to handwrite the Gospels out, or not the Gospels. He always required us to handwrite the letters out before we went to his class. And so you take a look at a letter, even like the letter to the Philippians, and you think, oh, there's only 4 chapters here. You write that out by hand, it takes you a really long time. So I'm with you on that. I do want to talk, before we move to the Gospel of John here, about I think what's really at the heart of your defense of the Farrer theory, and that's the idea of trajectories throughout the Gospels, which will ultimately lead us to the Gospel of John. So talk about that term trajectory, and how do we see this working out to hold the Gospels together?
Sure. And I always like to use the example of an accordion. If you start with Mark and it's fully compressed, it's just the simple story. It starts with the baptism. Jesus was a great teacher, but there's very little teaching. He rose from the dead, the end, right? Well, think about Matthew opening up that accordion, more of the folds of it. So you actually get a birth story, so you know where Jesus came from. And you get a lot more teachings in the middle, like the Sermon on the Mount. And you actually get that resurrection appearance to the Gospels in Galilee as promised, but not delivered in the Gospel of Mark. And then you move to Luke, and he just opens the accordion even beyond to say, well, where did John the Baptist come from? Let's start with a birth story for him. Let me give you some more teachings in the middle of Jesus, things that you don't know if you've already read Matthew and Mark. Because key to what I'm arguing is this copying and proliferation of highly similar works, that is not unprecedented by any means in antiquity. And the gospel writers, I am convinced, and I've said it repeatedly in publications, did not think they could displace their predecessors. I think they fully worked under the assumption that other people would read theirs alongside. And so they certainly thought they had something new to contribute, but Luke says as much, right? You other people have really tried at this, but I've talked to all the eyewitnesses, and I've weighed all of this from the beginning. John ends his gospel. Well, you can write all the books in all the world, still not say it all, but I've said what I've said. So they're aware that there are other Jesus books out there, and I think they're aware that what readers do is collect and compare them. So I don't think there's anything unusual about that for the reading practices or the writing practices of the Gospels. But Luke expands that the farthest, and Matthew leaves you dangling. Jesus appears to his disciples, and that's nice to have a resurrection appearance, not just the promise of one. But Matthew's closing words are, Jesus says, "I'll be with you forever till the end of the world." And I always open the door in my classroom and look, and I say, he's not out there. He's supposed to be here right now. Matthew clearly understands this. He's not expecting Jesus to show up, but Luke sees this as a problem, and he says, we need to explain how Jesus is here in spirit, but not here in body. So he ends with the ascension narrative after some different resurrection appearances that you haven't already read. So I think that kind of accordion model gives a lot of explanatory power in favor of the Farrer hypothesis that we just start small, we add to the beginning, the middle, and the end, and then Luke, that's what Matthew did. Luke does the same thing to Mark and Matthew by adding to the beginning, the middle, and the end. But you also see these trajectories where they know these tidbits that have come before. And part of this is working from Mark Goodacre's excellent article on editorial fatigue. And so he says, hey, when you get to this this parable of the talents that becomes the parable of the minas, you can see Luke rewriting it, but sort of lapsing into Matthean mode. And so I credit that article as much as anything with convincing me as a grad student of, yeah, okay, this actually works. But where that even occurs for Mark, it's in the farewell discourse. That's a Johann, I think. Right. It's the apocalyptic discourse. Mark says all of this at the end of the time and final judgment is going to happen really soon. You know, like when a slave owner comes back and he's left his slaves in charge and he calls them to account. And you read Mark, and it sounds like there's this great urgency, this immediacy, that the end is nigh. And Matthew says it's once upon a time. He takes this one liner from Mark, turns it into a full blown parable. A slave owner went away for a long time. So he's already taken away the immediacy of final judgment. But he does say it is like when a slave owner comes back and he calls his slaves to account. That's what final judgment is like. Luke takes that, rewrites the parable thoroughly, as Mark Goodacre has explained in great detail, but he relocates it before Jesus and the disciples even get to Jerusalem for Passion Week. And the narrator hits you over the nose with it and says, now his disciples thought that the kingdom was going to appear immediately. So he told them this story so that they would be patient and they would pray and remain faithful, all of this stuff. So you have this nice, neat trajectory of a one-liner. What happens when a slave owner goes away and comes back, and what does that have to do with final judgment? Matthew turns it into a full-blown parable, but he says, hey, don't wait. Don't hold your breath waiting for the return. And Luke says, definitely don't hold your breath at all. And you see them each working with the other that came before it. And once you get those kinds of trajectories going and you start looking for them, you find a bunch of them.
Well, we still have about 15 minutes or so left, and I want to switch to the Gospel of John. Now, there's a reason why the synoptic problem is called the synoptic problem, and that's because the three synoptic Gospels are very similar, and John is obviously very different. And you don't have to be a biblical scholar to pick up your Bible and see that when you're reading John, it feels at least like you're in a different world. And really, within New Testament scholarship, there's been kind of a very hard wall between what's going on in the synoptics and John. And I would say that it's probably fair to assert that for the majority of New Testament scholars, there's this belief that John could not have been at least heavily relying on the synoptics. And it is interesting. I interviewed Craig Blomberg on a book that he did a couple of months back called Jesus the Purifier, where he kind of argues for a rehabilitation of John as a source for historical material for understanding Jesus. And in that book, he deals a little bit with some of the scholarship that tries to connect the synoptics to John. But you really deal with this issue head on. And you argue in your book that John knew full well the synoptic gospels and in fact used them as sources. So walk us through that argument. How do we get a John that is just like aesthetically so different from the synoptics when he still uses them as like his primary sources in writing?
Great question. And you're dead on. There's no, even the casual reader will say Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very, very similar. John is so different. And roughly 80% by my count, if you're reading the Gospel of John, just doesn't have a close parallel in the synoptics. So some of that you just have to bracket and say John's doing his own thing. But I don't think that's a problem at all, because you think that the market's getting a little crowded once you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you've got a new Jesus book to write, you probably need to say something that we don't already know. And Mark Goodacre has his own book coming out on this subject. And so I won't steal any of his arguments, but read his chapter on how John is much more synoptic than previous scholarship has known. And even I read that after having written my own book and said, well, I wish I thought of all of these things that you bring up and say so much better than I could anyway. But where John has commonalities, boy, do you see similarities. And Stephen Hunt's dissertation on the feeding of the 5,000 is just this meticulous line-by-line analysis to say John has got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he knows details that are distinctive of each one. And John has rewritten it in his own way, but indebted to the others, and then turned it into the long theological discourse of, the bread of life. But you can even go back to the paralysis healing, right? We read this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's what I always use on the flip side of my handout of the synoptic problem. Then at the bottom of the page, I give you a couple of lines that are verbatim in the Gospel of John. It's oppositio in imitando. It couldn't be more different, right? In the synoptics, this poor guy who's paralyzed, he at least has his friends who are carrying him. And this is up in the Galilee. And in John, when Jesus heals a guy who's paralyzed, it's in Jerusalem, and the guy has no friends. Okay, it's so different that he has to know what the others have done. And Jesus says, the poor guy says, if only I could get into this pool when the angel stirs it, then I could be healed. And Jesus says, well, just get up and go. You don't yet know that the guy's paralyzed.
Right.
John has Matthew, Mark, and Luke that he's presupposing as he's rewriting, but he hasn't yet informed his audience that you could read this if you're second naivete, we call it, right? Read it like you don't already know the end of the story. Get up and go to the pool now could be get a head start on all the people who always beat you to the pool, and then you will just be healed. And then you find out, oh, the guy can't walk. That he could stand up and walk is the miracle. And then Jesus says, be careful you don't do anything to sin anymore. Well, why are you talking about sin? Because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus says, which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven or get up and walk. So John has all of this that he's presupposing as he's rewriting it. And when you put them together, you say, I don't think you would have dropped in these lines if you didn't have this working assumption. There are just times where you haven't told your audience what he's doing. He does other fun things, like in the Gospel of Mark, the priests bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate to be crucified. And Pilate says, oh, so you're the one they call the King of the Jews. Well, Luke reads that and he thinks it's a problem because he's not sure how Pilate knows to ask that question. So the priests hand Jesus over to Pilate, and the priests say, this is the one they call the King of the Jews. And Pilate says, so you're the one they call the King of the Jews, right? So we get to this scene in John, and the high priest, the priests take Jesus to Pontius Pilate, and Pilate says, you're the one they call the King of the Jews. And Jesus says, are you saying that on your own or because someone told you to say that? And it's brilliant, right? Because if you have Mark in mind, you got one answer. And if you have Luke in mind, you have another. And so he just makes these little moves to show you with a nod, I know what the others have done. And if you're an informed reader and you're really studying this, you could say, I see what you did there. I like that. That was a good move.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. The other thing that was really interesting about your take on John is that you have an entire chapter about the development of Christology through the New Testament period and even into the patristic period, which seems like, and on the face of it, a really strange addition to a book on the synoptic problem. But you look at how this development kind of parallels the argument you make about trajectories through the synoptics to John. So talk to us a little bit about that chapter. Like, what in the world does the development of Christology have to tell us about the synoptic problem?
Yeah, it's another great question, and one that surprised me, frankly. A chapter on Christology was the last thing that I expected to write. Oddly enough, Mark Goodacre ended up with a chapter on Christology too, and he and I have exactly the same thesis and wrote entirely different books that are completely complementary. So hopefully the two of us will really try to form a new consensus, and we know we're not the only ones working in that direction. But yeah, a lot of this came up through teaching. And so the more I would teach Paul, and we would kind of ask, Paul thinks that Jesus is Son of God, but what does that even mean? And how does he become the Son of God? At the beginning of Romans, it sounds like it's by virtue of the resurrection that he's declared to be Son of God, right? But you mentioned Philippians. In Philippians, we have the so-called Christ hymn, where Jesus is pre-existent, and then he's born, he lives, he dies, he's resurrected. And when he goes back, the resurrection and the exaltation, he goes back to being what he was before he was ever born. But if you get Deutero-Pauline and we get into Colossians or even to Hebrews, in those two places, we get what I call creator Christology. Hey, by the way, did you know that Jesus created the entire world that he would someday come into? And if you have read the entirety of the Pauline corpus, you would say, no, I did not know that. That is new information. Right. And what I saw, the more I taught Intro New Testament, the more I taught a class on Jesus, what have you, the Gospels are kind of following that same trajectory. We start with Mark, and not by virtue of the resurrection, but at least at the baptism, you can have this so-called adoptionist reading, where Jesus is declared to be the Son of God at the resurrection. He gets the Spirit that literally comes into him, and then he's got superpowers and he's working miracles. Matthew and Luke, by virtue of the incarnation and the nativity story, say that Jesus is the Son of God from the moment he is conceived. And John, much like what we see in Colossians and Hebrews, says, by the way, did you know that Jesus created the entire universe? And if you're reading the Gospels and only the Synoptics, you would say, no, I did not know that. I had only read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which mentioned no such thing. And so I saw this staircase in the Pauline corpus and in the Gospels where we start out with a relatively lower Christology. Now, don't get me wrong. Jesus is the Christ. He's the Son of God, right? But we also see a step up from that he didn't just become that at some moment, either baptism or resurrection. He was that before he was born or as he was conceived, what have you. And then we go one leap higher to say, and he created all things. There's not one thing that exists without him. And it just struck me that they were climbing the Pauline corpus and the Gospel corpus. We're climbing the same staircase and making the same moves. And I try to be careful in that chapter to say, look, there are so many swirling ideas about Christology. I am not trying. There are a lot of things when it comes to synoptic problem and John and the Synoptics. To my core, I am trying to oversimplify. And I say at the outset of the book, accuse me of oversimplification. I'll handle it all day because I'll bounce right back and say, you've just overcomplicated things. With the Christology chapter, I try to be careful and say, I'm not trying to oversimplify every piece of early Christian literature and every idea that anybody ever had about Jesus and his divinity. But I am just writing something down that I've been observing for 15 years of teaching now that just struck me so much. But those trajectories seemed to continue on the Christological level. And unfortunately, the higher the Christology, when we get to creator Christology, those also happen to be the texts where we get the greatest amount of anti-Judaism. Yeah. And so then I said, wow, it does seem to me to be something going on here. And then I felt for a general audience it worth going into what some of the councils were doing, the earliest councils at Nicaea and First Council of Constantinople, because something that was just a little seed in the dissertation, but really came to fruition is I don't actually think they're wrong or imposing something foreign with this idea of the so-called economic trinity, that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are coordinated in their workings in all things. Because when I read what John does with prophecy, that the Father speaks the word, and the word is utterly incomprehensible apart from the Spirit. John's model of prophecy gets you Constantinopolitan, the First Council of Constantinople. It gets you that Christology or that theology, that Trinitarianism, that I think John would say, yeah, you got it. That's what I was going for. And again, some folks will call that anachronistic, and in a sense it is, in that later interpreters were asking questions the gospel writers weren't always asking. But I actually think John is making an attempt to sort out how the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are interrelated. And at least when it comes to how prophecy functions for the early church, what they did 300 years later at Constantinople, I think John, if he could look forward in time, would say, you got it, A+.
Well, Dr. James Barker, we've covered a lot of ground. I cannot recommend this book enough for anyone that's interested in these issues. It's so important, but it is a very complex issue. And I think that there are a lot of people that really could be interested in this that just don't have a good starting point. And fortunately, your book is, I think, like I said before, very accessible to an educated audience. If you have the capacity to read at like a 12th grade level, you could pick up your book and pretty much figure out your way through it. But I know that there are other books out there. I read Alan Kirk's book on the synoptic problem last year. And that is just like, it's so technical, brilliant book, but it's just very, very difficult to get through for someone who's uninitiated. So for just one of my average listeners who might be new to the synoptic problem, maybe they have a general familiarity with it, they're interested in our conversation, what are some other resources that you would recommend to them to follow up on this conversation to learn more about the synoptic problem?
Sure. For the synoptic problem, Mark Goodacre is great. He wrote a book called The Synoptic Problem, A Way Through the Maze, and graciously has made it publicly available. So if you go to archive.org, he put the book out there so that anybody could read it for free if you don't mind reading, reading on screen. And he kind of walks you through how to do it. The other key is to have a synopsis or to make a synopsis. And I wrote a really nice review of Dewey and Miller's Complete Gospel Parallels. Now, it's a very colloquial English translation that turns off some readers and some of my students. But here's the thing, and I've done this for one short story on my handout. They did for the entire Gospels. If it's the same word in English, it's because it's the same word in Greek. Yeah. If in their synopsis, if it's a synonym, it's a similar word in English, it's because it's a slightly different word in Greek. That is incredibly difficult to do, not just for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but Gospel of Thomas. They lay all of that out. And so just having a synopsis so that you can, for yourself, see the similarities, see the differences. There's no substitute for doing a little bit of that work for yourself. My mom put together an Easter cantata for the Baptist church I was raised in. And she called me on the phone. She said, I'm starting to get what you do now because I can't make it all work, right? The order of events and when and where this or that happened and by whom, it's a little different. I said, yeah, that's you start going down the rabbit hole. But when somebody's already taken the trouble to put those in parallel columns for you, to let you see, oh, okay, this is the same story, but different wordings and inverting here or there. That's helpful. And like I say, Goodacre's book will kind of walk you through then how do we make sense of that and how have scholars answered it through the centuries. And hopefully I can add to that pile. And like you say, 12th grade, I have a really good friend who was teaching Catholic high school, and we were talking about assignments we give our students. And as I was writing, the longer it took me to write this book, which was way longer than it should have. But the good thing about that is the longer I wrote it, the more accessible it became. And the more I absolutely wanted this to be a book that was available and accessible to a general audience where anybody can pick it up, learn stuff they didn't know, and feel smarter without being condescending, right? With it being empowering, which is what I try to do as a teacher, but also for scholars to pick this up and say, I've never made a waxed tablet. Right. I've never spent a lot of time making scrolls and reading from them. And maybe there's something here that I should reconsider. So I do hope that it casts a wide net.
Well, before I let you go today, tell my audience where they can find your work.
Thanks so much. Eerdmans is the publisher. You can buy it directly from their website. It's available on Amazon. My wife showed me today. She said, you have the #1 book in new book in New Testament studies or something. Now that might last for a day. I don't know what the algorithm is. But yeah, so she took a screenshot of it. So she didn't make it up. And so Amazon is an obvious go-to place. Christian book distributors, Barnes and Noble, all those kind of main places. It's available, and I kind of do hope that it gets a wide audience, because I tried hard to make it accessible. Tons of pop culture references, yep. But always ones that actually make a point, that aren't just there for fluff, that give you something that you can think about, seize upon, and then say, oh, this actually does connect to book writing 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, well, again, I can't recommend it enough. And Dr. James Barker, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks a million for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. You can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.